The Russian counteroffensive to liberate the Ukrainian occupied areas of the Kursk Oblast has already stalled. Maybe it has already failed after initial successes. We'll talk about this as well as about Ukrainian attacks, all the changes along the front line that I was able to track, and troop generation woes. We talk about the overall strategic situation and Russian strikes on civilian shipping, and so much more in this situation report about the war in Ukraine. Ukraine says that since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, over 1,000 strikes and attacks were done against 200 objects of the energy infrastructure. This is just to show how intensive the Russian strikes against the Ukrainian energy infrastructure have been in the past. Over the last few days, the Russians obviously kept attacking, but none of those strikes was so out of the ordinary that it warrants the waste of our time by talking just the simple numbers. But we did have a prisoner exchange. Ukraine and Russia both exchanged 49 men, among them 15 fighters of the Azov regiment. They have been returned to Ukraine, and that should be the first time that Azov fighters have been returned to Ukraine for over a year. So a significant success for the Ukrainians to get some of them back. The Ukrainians, we talked in the last situation report that the Russians tried to liberate the areas occupied by the Russians here in the Kursk region, and they attacked southwards. The Ukrainians did counterattacks in this region here. We have a video showing the Ukrainians crossing over the border and sweeping through the Dragon Teeth here with armored pioneering engineering vehicles. This was at this point down here. And afterwards, we had geolocations of the Ukrainians being at the outskirts of the town of Obuchovka. This is up here, an advance of roughly 3.5 kilometers that was achieved here by the Ukrainians. And this shows, just to mark it here, this is roughly up to here that the Ukrainians managed to advance. The Russians, on the other hand, also had successes. We have a geolocation now that they are inside the town of Krasno Oktu and something more. I'm not trying to pronounce this town. They very likely have liberated that town from the Ukrainians. They managed to recapture it. This is the town here. It's still being shown as occupied by the deep state map, but we know that the Ukrainians have lost the connection to the town. The Russians also managed to advance further. We have them here at Vishnevka, west of Snagost. Here they are right on the railroad line. This is on the map here. It should be at this point. So we know that the Russians have reached more or less this area here and pushed the Ukrainians back from that part. But that's actually everything we have from the western area at the Glushkovo pocket. If we go further to the east, we still have fresh geolocations. Now the Russians are at are east of Shuravli, which we have here. This is on the map. It is at this point up here. So the Russians are now on the other side of that reservoir. Not much of a change. We had them in the past up here, and I mentioned that there we saw a small off-road vehicle being destroyed that carried ammunition, probably mortar shells, which would indicate that the actual front lines are further south. But now we have a geolocation at this point as well. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, still advance as well in the area. Here at Ruskoye Perechnoye, which is up here, which was considered to be contested in the past, we now have them at this point, if I'm not completely wrong. Let me quickly see. We see here, east of Ruskoye Perechnoye at Cherkaskoye Perechnoye. We have the Ukrainians down here, and this is at this point. So the Ukrainians have reached this region. Probably this should fall in the Ukrainian control as of now. So we see while the Russians have advanced in the northwest of the Ukrainian held territory, the Ukrainians themselves also advance at that area. That's it from the Kursk region because, as said, while the Russians have attacked and announced big successes initially, we do not see much of them having materialized. We switch over to the Kharkiv front line. No changes on the territory. The Ukrainians are reporting additional Russian attacks are continuing. Usually they are just with infantry, but sometimes also mechanized. They just recently published a video of a small mechanized Russian attacks with 2 BMP-2s and a T-72 MBT. The attack was defeated, so nothing has changed at this point. We switch over to the Eastern Front line here, and here we have minor changes from the previous dates. We have in the north the town of Senkivka that is still being shown as being held mostly by the Ukrainians. We had the Russians recently at this point here, so we know that it was already contested, and now we have actually a significant advance further south. Now the last position where we had the Russians was up here. Now they are down here already. This shows that they have advanced more or less. It should be to this position. Showing that this area here is probably already in the gray zone. The total control of Senkivka is still unclear. We still can't fully say to which degree those houses are fully occupied by the Russians as of now, but we see that they have actually managed to advance further to the south over the past few days. They also advanced at Piszczane, and northwest of it, roughly in this area here. This here we have a geolocation where they are now in the northwest of it. Not much of a change so far. They have been in those tree lines. They managed to cross that tree line and are now in the next one, starting to secure their flank, which, as we can see, this area here is fairly small, the area in between, and theoretically it could be threatened by the Ukrainians. It seems that they are concentrating also on securing their flanks at this point. The deep state map adds this area to the Russians here. This is some forested area. I do not have a geolocation for this, but as I've said in the past, when the pro-Ukrainian maps admit defeat at some point, we can more or less assume that this is true. We have here them also admitting that the eastern part of Makivka has fallen to the Russians. This is surely correct because we had geolocations on the western part, west of the Sherebets, at several times over the past few days. So this is just an adjustment reflecting the territorial control as it has changed over the past few days. South of the Seversky Donetsk, fighting is continuing in the area of Seversk, but I do not see any change. But we do have change here in the Chasiv Yar area. There we have the Russians advancing northwest of the town of Kalinina. This is here. Kalinina or Kalinivka. At this point, we have the, let me quickly check that I'm not wrong. This is Kalinina or Kalinivka. I'm not sure. This must be a transliteration area. So we have the Russians now roughly at this point here. They managed to advance either north at this point, or my mistake, I'm sorry. They are actually not here. The deep state map has already signed it in. I apologize. So we have the Russians gaining control over this. We had them previously here in the western part where they have managed to cross over the canal and establish themselves. Now they are advancing to the north into the forested area and have secured that as well. We have change at Klishivka as well, and here this is a significant change in the control of territory. Here we have the Russians being geolocated to the west of Klishivka. This is roughly at this point here. In the past, I already talked about that the Russians were seen here. They were seen at various points here, and I don't think the deep state map is even closely to what the current front line is. I can't fully confirm that though. I have geolocations usually of Russians being defeated, usually of Russians being attacked. That should be an indication that this is gray zone. Otherwise, why would the Russians manage to enter that area? But I'm not 100% sure. I think that the gray zone is actually significantly expanded to the west in this region here. But if we look at Petrenko's map, we see him showing already more movement, more gray zone towards the west here than in comparison to what the deep state map does. Both are pro-Ukrainian. Petrenko is more accurate, but he also doesn't show the Russian, the gray zone extended up to here. So to be honest, I'm not 100% sure. Theoretically, obviously, a small group might break through, might take shelter here and be defeated, and that doesn't mean that the Ukrainians don't still hold positions here. But as I said, as of now, I'm not completely sure, but I think the front line is probably significantly moved west of Klishivka at this point. We do not have proof that the Ukrainians have lost Andrivka, but the Russians were already to the northwest of it at several points in the past as well. And as I said, the most western positions of the Russians were roughly at this. So we should expect that this more or less is the gray zone, the current one. But yeah, unfortunately, I can't say much more at this point. We have Ukrainian counterattacks happening in the town of Toretsk. A video shows the Ukrainians striking the high rises here in the northern part of the area where there was fighting. First, FPV drones are striking the buildings, then an M2 Bradley is engaging and giving covering fire while infantry disembarks. So we have Ukrainian counterattacks at this point. The area here is probably in the gray zone as of now, but the Russians managed to advance an additional 200 meters along the main road towards the west. So far we had them here, now we have them a little further to the west, and there again the only proof of Russian presence is an FPV, is a drone that drops munition and kills Russian infantry that is already wounded on the ground here. So it could be correct that this area is still under Ukrainian control, because at least the visual evidence shows presence, but not successful presence in this area. This is kind of the problem here. But overall, it's probably safe to assume that the Russians are pushing towards the west and might have some successes here. West in the Pokrovsk area, we have the Russians now north of Novorodivka. Now they are confirmed there. This is the area here. We had them in the past there. We assumed that the area there was already taken. It wasn't visually fully confirmed. We knew that the Ukrainians engaged down here, but whether this area was still whether it was under solid Russian control or not was somewhat contested. From all the informations I had from the Ukrainian side was that they had given up Novorodivka. So I assumed this was solid under Russian control as of now. I didn't see visual evidence, but now we have the Russians to the northeast of it, so we can fully assume that the Russians have consolidated their control over Novorodivka. Then further south we have a geolocation as well. This is, by the way, just an update from what I've seen here in the past, where we saw the Russians engaging Ukrainians. Further south we have an update from Ukrainsk, and that shows that the Russians must be further down in control of Ukrainsk, as it's here a geolocation of the evacuation of civilians, where Ukrainian volunteers talk to Russian soldiers, and there isn't even fighting close by. So the southern area here must already be more or less solidly under Russian control. To which degree the Russians have advanced further north is unclear. We talked about it, that the Russians aim for a turning maneuver to force the Ukrainians to abandon Ukrainsk. Whether that has already happened or not, I cannot say. But we see that not only Lizivka has fallen to the Russians a couple of days ago, but Ukrainsk is already significantly more under Russian control than we've seen in the past. It might have already fallen, even though that's speculation at the current point. The Russians also managed to advance further to the southwest here. They have reached the town of Hostre. We have a geolocation of them being at this point here. Now this is dangerous for the Ukrainians, as the mechanized advance by the Russians managed to reach the town, and they have more or less cut off the lines of communication for the Ukrainians to the east of it. Everything in here is now cut off from their lines of communication. Now they will be able to probably withdraw on foot over the area here. They might be able to cross over here, and there shouldn't be much much vehicles there anyways. It's mostly infantry here, or exclusively infantry, maybe some mortars that might have to be abandoned in case of withdrawal, but the resupply for them seems to be close to impossible as of now, so I would expect them to be forced to withdraw really soon. Here again we have the deep state map showing Maximilianivka more or less under solid Ukrainian control, but we've seen in the past the Russians roughly at these positions inside of Maximilianivka, even though a recent geolocation that I mentioned showed the Ukrainians taken prisoner here, recapturing some area. So we know the area is already under contested by each side, but as of now I cannot confirm that the Russians have taken the eastern part of Maximilianivka, or that they even control the northern part and thus the area towards the river here. So there should be a possibility for the Ukrainians to withdraw at that point, and we'll have to see when they do it. We shouldn't be surprised if over the next few updates this area here is falling fully into the Russian hands as well. Further west, I do not have any updates anymore. It seems to that this was the overall change in territory that I can confirm. Here we just have another confirmation of geolocations that we had in the past. But we have, when we talk about the overall situation, we have news from the Black Sea as well. Their Russian mill bloggers are now confirming that they have lost a Sukhoi 30 SM, one of their fighter bombers over the western Black Sea. It was shot down by the Ukrainians with a manpads, obviously from the rigid inflatable boats that the Ukrainians were using to attack the drilling platforms there. There's also a video that was published by the GUR that shows a video feed from a Bayraktar TB2 that did reconnaissance to support the troops here. It shows the Sukhoi 30 passing by, and later it shows a fireball that seems to be the plane that is hit. So while we don't have full visual evidence that it was actually shot down, if we put the puzzle pieces together, it seems to be certain that the Ukrainians managed to take down this fairly modern Russian fighter bomber over the western Black Sea. Also, here in the area roughly here, the Russians hit a freighter. It was a grain freighter registered in St. Kitts and Nevis on the way to Egypt to transport grain. As we can see, significant damage on the ship. According to reports, it was hit by a KH-22 launched from a Tupolev 22M, so a anti-ship missile that hit it. It hit it, and that's the important part, because some reports were otherwise. It hit it in international waters. It didn't hit it in Romanian territorial waters. It hit it inside the Romanian exclusive economic zone. That allows Romania to, for instance, have the fishing rights. I think they have the drilling rights in the exclusive economic zone, but it's not their property. Apart from economic rights, shipping can happen there, fighting can also happen there. So this was not inside of NATO territory. Why the freighter didn't stay within the 12-mile zone inside of Romania, I can't say, but we'll have to see how it turns out. The good news of all of this is nobody on board was injured or died, so at least no casualties in this attack. Let's talk about the overall situation. We go to Kursk here. The attacks going towards Nagost, which, by the way, is still not confirmed to be under Russian control. It seems to be contested as of now. The attacks were done by the 137th VDV Regiment that in August was still operating in Siversk, so here in the area here. This shows that the Russians have redeployed units here, and as a VDV unit, even though it has suffered in quality in comparison to the beginning of the war, they are still considered to be of higher quality than other units, and thus we see that where the better troops of the Russians attacked, they had some successes, but only at very limited positions. Overall, the troops that are facing the Ukrainians are of mixed quality, a lot of it conscripts, a lot of it scraped together units of various origins. At this point, where the better units were attacking, they were able to have some success, but in overall, it was not a complete change of the dynamic at this point. We see that the successes of the Russians were very limited. Still though, the Ukrainian counterattacks or the Ukrainian attacks into the Glushkovo pocket, so far I do not see them being massively successful either. Okay, so they might have advanced 3 kilometers. We do not know if they actually managed to hold the area here, let alone whether they managed to occupy a town here. And it is a defeat. We do not need to sugarcoat this. It is a defeat that the Russians managed to take the town here. It's not 100% sure if they can actually supply the western part of the Glushkovo pocket here, as they have been defeated here. Here here it would obviously allow the railroad dam to use for resupply, but we should not forget there is a river here. Whether this can be forded or not, I'm unfortunately not able to say. It looks like it could be regarding the size, so it might be possible that the Russians have re-established lines of communications through here, even though probably only with all-terrain vehicles, with off-road vehicles, not a regular road at this point, but some supply should probably be able to be transferred from Korenevo directly to Glushkovo in the near future. That is a disadvantage for the Ukrainians. That is a local tactical defeat at that point, because it obviously makes it less likely for the Ukrainians to be able to take over the Glushkovo pocket. But in overall, the Russian successes have, at least so far, been really, really limited. Let's switch to the Pokrovsk region. That's the other hotspot of the fighting here. And here we have an interesting analysis from a Russian mill blogger at that point. You can pause the video in case you want to read it in total by yourself. But he basically said that the attacks in the direction of Pokrovsk are getting weaker and weaker because there's ever fewer personnel and material. So the Russian reserves are running out. We talked about it in the past when the Ukrainians were starting their Kursk offensive. The soldiers from that region, I think he was one of the mill bloggers also saying that we can still keep up the offensives, but they're taking stuff from behind us. So the frontline units are not being weakened, but the rear units that would then replace the expanded frontline units, they were weakened. And he's also he basically says that he's afraid the own Russian offensive towards Pokrovsk is reaching its culmination at this point. He's also mentioning that the enemy obviously still has strategic reserves, and how drastic the situation here is. His interpretation is that drone pilots have now been moved to the assault infantry, which would obviously be a massive weakness for the Russians if they have to use specialists to keep up the infantry attacks and thus lose people with special abilities in simple fighting. We've seen that on the Ukrainian side as well, using specialists as infantry in times of dire need. This would mean that the Russians want to keep pressing forward even though they ran out of regular infantry, or they are in the process of running out of regular infantry, even though this argument might be countermanded by something I'm going to mention when we're talking about troop generation by the Russians. So we'll come to that. We'll come back to the point of drone pilots being used as assault infantry in a few minutes. At Marinka, in the Marinka area here, or in the south, if we wanted, Marinka is no longer in combat. The Kurakhove area, we see that the Russians have created a cauldron here between Hostre and Georgivka. The Ukrainians will probably be able to withdraw from that, but they will not have much of a choice but to withdraw unless they manage to recapture Hostre and solidify the control over it, as the lines of communication should more or less be cut at this point. When we come to international aid or the overall situation about striking into Russia, it seems like it's about to happen that Storm Shadow and Scalp are at least Storm Shadow, probably Scalp as well, are going to be used against Russia. It's not being publicly known yet, at least at the moment where I finish the research, but the news are now saying that ATACMS will not be allowed. Biden will allow, interesting too, Biden will allow that Scalp and Storm Shadow are being used inside of Russia, but no US missiles. This means that the US are shying back from allowing the Ukrainians to use their own weapons, but they are going to allow other weapons. Maybe that is testing the water, and later ATACMS will still be allowed to strike into Russia, but we'll have to see whether this is happening. There's also discussion that the US are working right now with the Ukrainians to identify targets that are being allowed to be struck inside of Russia and others not, to limit the escalation. But we have to say, if this is true, and there's still an if in this whole argument, but if this is true, then it's effectively choosing the targets by the US. If you're afraid that you are being provoking Russia, if you're afraid that you are being involved in the fighting, then limiting the targets that are allowed to be struck is at the same time choosing which targets are allowed to be struck. And that is that is far closer to participating in the war by choosing targets for the fighting force than it would be otherwise if Ukraine would simply be allowed to strike everything. So at least from the point of arguing whether or not the US get involved by choosing targets or not, the current potential, the current claimed political process is the exact opposite of what the US government claims. We have news from maybe sabotage, unclear. Omsk Transmash was burning heavily yesterday. I do not have the reason yet. I do not have the damage yet, but the pictures showed huge smoke plumes over the factory. And in this factory, they are building tanks. The T-80 BVM is being built there. They're building IFVs, and they are building self-propelled artillery at this point. So to which degree that fire damaged something that will reduce the output is obviously unknown. It's also unknown whether that was sabotage or simply an accident, but it's still nevertheless interesting that Omsk Transmash had a heavy fire. And in troop generation, we come back to the drone topic here. We have Riba talking about drones, and they are mentioning that 2 drone pilots that were apparently fairly well known were moved to the assault infantry after criticizing the leadership, and thus they were lost by being expended as assault infantry. They are mentioning here that this is still politics inside of the Russian armed forces, that critical voices are being expended, they are being sent into the frontal assaults where the highest losses are being used as a punishment to basically keep down criticism. This could be that the other Russian mill blogger here, that he heard about two drone pilots being killed and thus takes the conclusion that the Russians have run out of assault infantry and thus switched over to using even their drone pilots as infantry or not. This is my assumption. In seeing both messages, that doesn't mean that this happened. It doesn't mean that the Russians do not regularly switch over to use all the available soldiers as assault infantry in Pokrovsk, but it should not be ignored that this is a coincidence when both these events happen at the same time. Obviously that this is mad in regards to troop generation, to maintaining specialties inside of the troops. If you punish criticism by basically sending them to die is a very stupid way to run your military. But yeah, the Russians are still continuing to do this, and Riba is criticizing it here as well. Russia has now already also started to use flamethrower drones. Just a week after the Ukrainians after it became public that the Ukrainians used those flamethrower, thermite, dragon drones, whatever you want to call them, the Russians are now having confirmed to use them as well. This is probably not because they were that fast within a week. It's more that the usage of those drones predated the visual evidence for quite a while. Unclear how long, but it allowed the Russians to copy the idea, and they have now started it as well. Also, the Ukrainians are reporting that the Russians have now started to use acoustic sensors as well to identify UAVs and cruise missiles. This is again a clear copy of the Ukrainian systems. It came to be known like half a year ago that the Ukrainians have set up thousands of microphones all around the country. They are connected with the mobile network and simply record the noises they hear. And thus you can obviously identify the specific sound of a cruise missile, engine, because you have the data banks. You can identify the sound of Shahid drones, and by triangulating you can see where they are flying. You can adjust it, and you have pre-warning even if they don't appear on the radar. A smart passive system that thus cannot be defeated by a missile or something like this, because it's tiny and it is passive, and to identify it is close to impossible for the Russians. This has proven to be highly successful. Now we see the Russians copying the Ukrainian system. We've seen that again and again in this war. Whenever one side develops something successful, the other side tries to copy it as well. In troop generation, we have news as well. The first group of Ukrainian pilots has finished their training on the Alpha jet in France. They have been trained there in a basic flying training, basic flying combat training, not to fly the Alpha jet inside of Ukraine. They are now, it's now being reported that they were sent to Romania to start their training on the F-16 there. So the next group has started training on the F-16 as well. And in troop generation or production, we could say, we have news that Ukraine has restarted production of the 545 ammunition. That's the standard smaller caliber for the AK system, introduced with the AK-74. This is comparable, I guess, with the 5.56 in NATO compared to 7.62 before. This is special in regards, while it initially surprised me too, how can it be that they have restarted production and it took them 2 years since the full-scale invasion? They didn't do it before. Well, they had production facility, but the factory was in Luhansk, so it got lost in 2014, and I guess the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian military, had other priorities than to restart production of that ammunition type, probably importing it, maybe still having stockpiles enough so they didn't need to produce anything, but now they have restarted production and we have visual evidence for this. But that's it from me for now. Before we finish, I want to thank Mrs. Rachel Wilkinson, Rachel Wilkinson. With this election, thought you might appreciate this. As a miserable childless cat lady, I always enjoy seeing your fur babies in the video. You do great work. Keep at it. Thank you very much for your presence. She gave me At War with Ourselves, my tour of duty in the Trump White House from H.R. McMaster. I had that on my wish list in case you want to send me something as well. The wish list is in the description. But that's it from me for now. Thank you very much, by the way. I think I said it already, but in case not, thank you very much for that present. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps with the algorithm. Leave a comment in the comment section. What do you think about the current developments and the US policy, for instance, towards striking into Russia? If you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. This channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. Thank you to everyone already supporting this channel, but that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.